Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We are in 1 Corinthians 13 today, the love passage. I feel so in love right now, Rob. Is this going to be the Valentine's Day episode?
Yeah,
we ruined it.
Bad call on my part. Hey, I need you to do me a favor, by the way, today. If you haven't noticed, we have a lot of notes today and we have a lot of content to go through 1 Corinthians 13. I need you to behave yourself.
Yeah, I'm the problem.
Yeah,
I'm the issue. Yeah.
You got to behave yourself so we can get through this today. All right? Because last time was just not good.
Well, and last time you kept like a minute and a half of what I think was about a 15-minute ordeal.
Yeah.
So let's not do that again. I will definitely not bring up rack shot.
Yeah, I got things to do.
Yeah, and I didn't even end up making my point.
No, I noticed that, Bob, if you're listening here and you listen to the recording, that Vinnie was going to make the point later, and then he never actually made the point. So I'm like, oh yeah, I never got to that. But hey,
I'm going to make that point. Because it's really quick. Here's the thing I love about that moment where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Thank you.
To use I would say their Christian names. It's literally not their Christian names.
No,
they're Babylonian names.
The Babylonian names.
But there's this point in Daniel chapter 3 in which they're gonna the doom is coming. They're gonna get their consequence for not, worshiping a false god, false deity, and their whole thing is, because we were talking, the context for us talking about this is like faith healers and what happens when someone isn't healed and that sort of thing. And we sometimes pray for the will of God, but we kind of do it in a way where it's like, but because we don't believe that God actually can.
It leaves us an out. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And I just love their response, because their response is like, hey, our God will save us and he can save us, but even if he doesn't, he's still God.
That's right. Yeah. Even if he does not.
Yes.
Yeah. And I will not bow down to you.
Yes. Yeah. And because it's like, it's so confident. And it's like, no, he will, and he can, but even if he doesn't.
Right.
And I don't know, which is a comforting, which is great, mature. And those are like kids. Like, I'm 44 and I'm not that wise. So anyway.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah, right. Let's be honest. Okay. Anyway, what are we doing today? You were going to say something.
Let me comment on this. We talked about the love chapter, and I remember when I was preaching, or even when I was teaching, I'm like, okay, I'm going to teach on this topic, or I'm going to preach on this, the book of James or 1 Corinthians or Matthew or whatever. I always would think and go, oh, you know what? There's something in that book there that I'm still working on myself. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I'm ready to preach this, right? Because you're preaching and your wife is sitting there, it's just like, oh, hypocrite, right? You just have to say, listen, I need to be able to do this myself as well as I can. And sometimes you're honest and vulnerable, like, hey, I'm working on this too. But the love chapter is just one of those things, like, I'm not sure either one of us are really ready for this today, because the reality is this is hard. It's not, it's obviously I can do all things through Christ Jesus who gives me strength, but this is a work in progress. We are a work in progress. Yeah, don't ask our wives. We're not going to invite them on the podcast. Hey, let's have special guests. Have your wife. I'm like, no, let's not do that.
Let's not do that. Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think this is the, you said this should be a Valentine's Day episode or whatever. This should be an episode for like every single week we talk, because this is the essence of Christendom, right? Jesus Christ is Lord, and our responsibility is to image him and model him and do what he did and make him known. And what he did and does is love. That's who he is. And so this is the essence of Christendom. So I think that's really significant.
So we hinted at this last week, I want to say, but chapter 13, it's not the wedding chapter, because we always hear this at a wedding, right? But that's not what's happening here. This is in the middle of the conversation about spiritual gifts.
Yeah. 1 Corinthians 12 and 14 are about spiritual gifts. And then we say 13 is the love chapter. And the answer is no, 13 is also about spiritual gifts. Notice that chapter 12 ends in verse 31 with, but earnestly desire greater gifts. And then 14 verse 1 begins with, yet earnestly desire spiritual gifts. And the Greek is almost identical. It changes one word. This is a way of framing a text, right? You begin a passage or a verse or a section or a whole book with a certain statement or a phrase, and then you close that passage or phrase or whole book with a certain phrase by repeating it. And that's what's going on. So the passage is framed with, hey, earnestly desire spiritual gifts and earnestly desire the greater gifts. And so I think we have to understand the fact that what is happening here is Paul saying, look, you guys can talk about being spiritual all you want and by being spiritual people and whatever it might be, but unless you use your gifts, unless you use those gifts in love, sorry, they're worthless.
And ultimately, love is at the heart of the biblical story. In a sense, it's it's the heart of the Christian ethic. And we would say it's not because it's not love for love's sake, but it's love because this is what comes from God. I like the first thing I think about is John 3:16, which everyone knows because you've seen you've seen a football game.
The football game, yeah.
Exactly. But even the first John 3:16, which it's not like that's a coincidence. It's just how scholars 500 years ago happened to insert chapter and verse divisions. But it says, by this we know love, that Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers, the fellow Christians.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And it's easy to gloss over a verse like that too, but just look at that verse again. NIV says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another.
Mm-hmm.
Like, wow, there you go. Yeah. And that's the whole essence of what love is. Like, love is laying down your lives for one another. Absolutely.
Yeah. One issue that I don't want to say issue, confusion that I think is kind of popular in a sense in church. And I would even say it's probably like borders on heresy. So I remember hearing a sermon a few years ago in which the pastor was wanting to highlight the fact that God is love. And so he was making the point that because God is love, he needed something to love, and that's why he created. And it's our duty now as creation. We owe him to love back because that is our purpose, which I'm thinking is like, that just completely destroys any meaningful theology of the Trinity. Right.
Yeah. It radically undermines the Trinity. In fact, and obviously it radically undermines the nature of God too, because God has a need. Right. And obviously it has all kinds of problems. I probably shouldn't go down that rabbit trail too much, but the nature of love is the fact that there must be someone else to love, another to express that love. And that affirms the Trinity then. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have existed eternally in a loving relationship with one another. God has no need at all to create. He didn't need to create at all. He didn't need us to love him back, or, hey, let's do him a favor and help the guy out. After all, the big dude did make all this stuff.
Yeah.
That's blasphemous. Yeah, it's absolutely problematic. But yeah, to reiterate the point, love is Trinitarian and only makes sense that God is love. The idea that God is not a Trinity has a problem at this point also, right? So if it's other churches or religious groups that claim to be Christian or whatever it might be, but deny the Trinity, God is one. That's it. If God is one, then there was nothing for him to love, and he had a need. He did need to create so that he could have something to love. But if God exists as Father, Son, and Spirit eternally, then he had no need to create because they existed eternally in a loving relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to recognize too, then, when we look at the biblical story, especially, I don't want to say especially in the New Testament story, but when you see how Jesus interprets the 10 commandments, there's actually only 2 commandments. It's love God and love neighbor, which is, you could sum up all 10 in those 2 kinds of categories.
Yeah. And we did have a podcast where we discussed that a little bit more in the Gospel of Mark's passage and there also. But yeah, the key is that these 2 commandments are interrelated. So you shall love the Lord your God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. All right. Those aren't isolated. The idea is that if you love God, it will manifest itself in your love for your neighbor, and even your enemies, like Jesus says.
So it's not saying that there's like options, like you could pick one of these things to love.
Exactly. And that's, I think, the argument that I was trying to make in the communion discussion that we had in 1 Corinthians 11 a few weeks ago. And that is that you can't take communion when we're abusing our brother or sister in Christ, or treating them poorly or disrespecting them and what have you. If we're in conflict with a brother and sister in Christ, they are and we are together the body of Christ. And then you can't take communion, which is the body of Christ, and it's a contradiction. And so there has to be a resolution there. So I think the way our love for God gets manifested is in our love for one another.
But this is where I would, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but when you look at maybe the divide in the Christian world, especially in America, between maybe the evangelical right, who's very concerned about theology and right doctrine, and then you might have the evangelical left, we could call them, that is very concerned about social justice issues. Yeah, you call that. And this is where I think Tim Keller does a really good job of chastising both sides of the equation, where it's like, hey, evangelicals on the right, great job of emphasizing right theology and right doctrine. Like, that's good, but it can't be that's not more important than loving your neighbor. And guess what? People on the left, loving your neighbor is not meaning you're actually believing the right way. And so I guess my question or statement or whatever would be, by merely showing love for one another, that doesn't mean you love God. I know great altruistic atheists or people of other religions that are just like, it's like, you're a better person than I am. But unfortunately, I don't think you know God, or I don't think you love God.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's fine. Absolutely. I would agree.
Yeah. Cool. So let's define love then. What does it mean by that? There's, especially, I don't know, in this day and age, love is, I don't even know how to define that word.
Love is in the air.
Exactly. Exactly. And I love my son and my wife and pizza. And I love to hate, Bostonian sports teams.
Yeah, there's still hope for you.
Do you want to talk about the Patriots game from last weekend?
No, I don't.
You don't want to talk about the Raiders-Patriots game?
I'm going to edit that out so you can talk all you want.
Yeah.
Remember, I do the editing. So.
The greatest ending to a football game in history.
Yeah. So I think 1 Corinthians 13 is going to do this for us, and we're going to understand exactly what Paul is getting at here. And let me make a couple comments on that. First off, let me make the comment of that this chapter is also conditioned by the situation in Corinth to which Paul is responding. So I don't think we would look at this and go, this is the treatise on love that Paul sat down and said, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about love. Let me cover all the bases. He's specifically applying the topic of love to the issue in Corinth and the problems in Corinth, so it can extend more broadly. But secondly, I think the essence of love is that love looks like the cross. That's what love looks like. As Paul says in Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and laid down his life for her or for it. This is the essence of love. Love essentially is a willingness to sacrifice self for the sake of others. And I think Philippians 2, of course, which we'll get to in a few months on our podcast, eventually we'll get there. Consider others better than yourselves, right? And then he goes on to say, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, well, being in very nature God, became human and became, as a human, suffered on the cross, and then God exalted him. So I think this is the essence of love. So the thing I would point out then in 1 Corinthians 13, love is not self-seeking. Love seeks the interest of others. So, and in 1 Corinthians 14, which we'll get to in our next episode, then Paul's going to argue that to use your spiritual gifts in love means that you're concerned with building up the body of Christ. You're doing it for them. So it's not loving to go, I'm a great teacher, so let me get up and pontificate for an hour, and you're going to listen to me because I'm a great teacher. That's not love. To be a great teacher means to say, I care that you learn, and that you know and that you understand. A server, a person who has the gift of serving, just serves because they rejoice in serving, but they also want to serve you. And that's the essence of love. I think that's the key feature of it.
When we use a word like love, it oftentimes has like it's like the highest on the hierarchy of emotions. And so it's like, I might like person A, but I love person B, and I love them because I've already liked them and I grew in my relationship. There's that scale there. But love doesn't necessarily have to work that way. I could love someone and not necessarily like them. I'm reading Tim Keller's book on forgiveness right now, and he even talks about that, how a wife who is being abused, like she needs to protect herself, and what does forgiveness look like in that situation? But she could still call the police.
Yes. Right.
And that is actually a loving thing to do, even though you don't like the husband at this moment.
Yeah. Actually, a really important qualification we probably should make right now too. And that is to call the police and have your husband turned in and get him the help actually is the most loving thing you can
exactly.
do. The idea of saying, well, I'm sacrificing myself for him is not, and being abused and tolerating that is not love, because that's actually not helping this person even get better.
Yeah.
Or allowing them to act criminally upon you is not loving. So love does not like injustice, is a way of putting it. Maybe another way of saying it is, love lays down one's life for those who are doing injustice, but it doesn't mean that I have to like those who are doing injustice. And a good way of thinking that is, Jesus did not like Rome for crucifying him. Yet he loved the Romans who crucified him. And in fact, he died for them. So much so that when he's on the cross and the crowd's gathering around him saying, hey, you saved others, now save yourself. The way I like to discuss that verse is, you saved others, now save yourself. For most humans, especially men, the idea of standing up for yourself and proving yourself, right, that's on the table here, Jesus. You saved others, now save yourself. Oh, I could get off the cross and I'll show them who I am. I mean, that's exactly what I would do, right? That's what we would do. I'm going to show them, I'm going to shut them up once and for all. I've had enough with these people. The second Jesus gets down from the cross, he condemns them all.
Yeah.
So to love them is to stay on the cross, even though they're doing the act of one of the greatest injustices in the history of the world, if not the greatest, because it's an innocent person who's being crucified.
I forget if I have shared this example before, but it's one that's worth repeating, because you'd mentioned how Jesus still loved Romans, even though Rome was committing the injustices. And Richard Wurmbrand's book, Tortured for Christ. And you could get free copies of that. I think if you just go to voiceofthemartyrs.com, they send those things out like hotcakes. And he's this Romanian pastor who was jailed twice, I think for a total like 14 or 15 years. It's been a while since I read the book, but there's this example of him talking about all the injustices, communism, and how they were killing pastors' kids in front of them because the pastors would not renounce Jesus. Just the awful, awful things that literally make you weep when you read it. And there's a point in there where he says, I hate communism. And, it's obvious by this point how awful it is. He says, but I love communists. And it's like, man, if there's anyone who has the right to who has earned the right to say all you are wrong, all you are evil, it's Richard Wurmbrand. And the fact that he still says, but I love communists, the persons.
Let me add to that a little bit too, because I think what we see on Facebook and social media is people hating Democrats or hating Republicans or hating this politician or hating abortionists or non-abortion, pro-lifers or whatever. And the answer is, in your hatred of that, you're actually displaying an attitude of anger and hatred towards them.
Yeah.
And so to love them means to treat them with respect and to treat them with dignity and with honor, even though you don't like them or agree with them or appreciate them, or you think so there's a fine line there sometimes, right, between calling out injustice and maintaining a love for individuals. And I think we've crossed that line a long way back and need to reconsider that, how we go back.
Yeah. So as you said, the lead into this chapter it's Paul showing a more excellent way of doing something. So what does that look like?
So let me give a quote from Gordon Fee, who sadly passed away just a few months ago, I think it was, but one of the great biblical New Testament scholars. He said, "Let the interpreter beware, lest too much analysis detract from its sheer beauty and power," referring to 1 Corinthians 13. Unfortunately, however, the love affair with this love chapter has also allowed it to be read regularly apart from its context. Even worse is that reading of it in context, which sees it as set over and against spiritual gifts. So I think it's let's look at this more excellent way, and let's look at it with understanding it in its context. And it's probably not a husband to its wife per se, as much as it is how we deal with spiritual gifts within the context of the church. So let's go ahead and read 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 through 13 to start with.
If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been known fully. So now faith, hope, and love abide. These three, but the greatest of these is love.
Let's just begin by noting, of course, as I mentioned earlier, that the context is set with spiritual gifts. And Paul begins by saying, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels. Verse 2, if I have the gift of prophecy. The context is the Corinthian people who were likely proud of their spiritual gifts and had probably thought of themselves as some spirit, having attained something, maybe in 1 Corinthians 15, we're going to discuss the fact that some say that there is no resurrection of the dead. They may have had some kind of theology that says that we have reached the end, we've reached the height, and that's evidenced by our spiritual gifts. And Paul's answer is, you guys are divisive. You guys are abusing the poor at communion. You guys have a man in your congregation who has his father's wife, and you're proud of him. You guys are doing all these, making all these rules against widows and against people that aren't married. And wait a second, let's go back here and address this more carefully. If I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but I don't have love, it's worthless. And we'll get this in chapter 14, because tongues without interpretation don't benefit anybody, because nobody knows what you said. They might even lead to your own arrogance and boastfulness, right? And if you have the gift of prophecy and you know all mysteries and all knowledge, but you don't have love, it's like, it's nothing, it's worthless. So I think the context becomes so significant, as we mentioned earlier. Now, notice again that tongues is the first item listed on the list. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, likely because that was the gift that they were emphasizing the most, and that the Corinthians had placed the most emphasis upon. And that's also likely why tongues is at the bottom of the list in chapter 12, when Paul lists, hey, first of all, there's apostles. Secondly, there's prophets. There's teachers. And then he gets down to the end and says various kinds of tongues. So I think this sets the context for us a little bit there.
Yeah. Hey, we're still in verse 3. So you had made the comment about being burned. I read from the ESV, and I didn't catch, obviously, when I was reading it, another translation there. The other translations usually have something to do with about boasting. So that's an interesting rendering there. I read a quick textual note and how it's just a variant between manuscripts. It's interesting that the ESV would choose to go with that reading.
Which one did the ESV go with?
With if I deliver up my body to be burned.
Okay.
Instead of if I deliver up my body in order to boast.
So the ESV is going to be more in line with the King James. So the difference between burned and boast in Greek is actually one letter. And so someone changed the letter at some point in time. It probably makes the most sense that if I make this boast, makes more sense than being burned.
With the context, it makes sense, right?
Yeah, exactly. If I do all these things, and then I make this boast, it's like, wait a minute, then that's not love. It's worthless. Some have suggested that under the persecution of Nero was torching Christians, right? And Nero is in the 54 to 68 AD. So Jesus dies in the year 30. So you're looking 25 to 35 years after the death of Jesus. Nero is the emperor. And early 60s, he starts persecuting Christians. And he was having them burned. And so some have suggested that maybe as early as that, the idea that if I offer my body to be burned, that's where that tradition came in. Now, 1 Corinthians was written before that anyways. But long story short, I think it probably is more likely that I do all these things to the poor, and so that I may boast, than it is that I may be burned.
Yeah.
Let's notice this. So he begins verses 1 through 3 by saying these spiritual gifts, if they're not used in love, then they're worthless. And then he goes to really kind of define love. And again, remember, this may not necessarily be an exhaustive list of what love is, but when he defines love, he lists really 10 things. There's two positive features. Love is patient, love is kind. And then he has 8 negative things. And I provided, for those who are listening, I provided for Vinnie, kind of laid this out kind of in the Greek text, so it's easier to see the order and structure of the way that Paul has this laid out. There's 8 things that are all in the negative. And then the last of those 8 items, and Vinnie can see this more clearly, in verse 6, love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. That's one thing. And you can see the structure, Vinnie, that there's no and or ooh or something like that connecting the two. Instead, it's a de, which is but. So it does not rejoice with unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. So there's 2 positives. Love is patient, love is kind. And then there are 8 negatives. And the negatives, it's interesting, like the implication is this is what you're not doing. And I think that's the items on this list. These are things that you're not doing. And if you actually took a list, these words, and then did a search on when they appear in 1 Corinthians, you begin to realize, oh, that's exactly what Paul's talking about. All the things that you guys are not doing. So he begins by saying, and again, if you have a comment here, feel free to interject. He begins by saying, it is not envy, or it's not jealous. And in chapter 3, verse 3, that's specifically one of the things that they were doing in the church in Corinth. They were very envious and jealous of others. So then he says it doesn't boast. Then he says it doesn't boast, and it is not proud. And then it goes on, and that's not rude. Right? And the idea of rude is it doesn't behave shamefully or disgracefully or unbecomingly. One commentator says that shameful behavior is not loving. It's kind of the idea there.
That would be interesting we've talked so much about an honor and shame society that this is written in. And so like, this is not Paul's way of mere reconciliation or making people warm and fuzzy. This is very countercultural in that regard.
Yes, because in that culture, you did things to get yourself an advantage, which was often an advantage of like, I want food tomorrow, right? I mean, you're trying to get ahead there. So you give honor to the people that have honor, and you shame those who have shame, or you don't give them honor if they don't have honor. And Paul's like, no, that's not what this does. Interestingly, the word for rude is used in chapter 7, verse 36. Let me turn there first. Where he says, if any man thinks he is acting unbecomingly towards his virgin daughter. It's this idea of shameful behavior or rude behavior, inappropriate behavior towards his virgin daughter. All right, then it goes on to say it's not self-seeking, which I think is kind of your preeminent definition, the standard by which everything else falls into. Paul's going to say in the book of Romans, Jesus did not please himself, Romans 15, verse 3. So then it says love is not easily angered. It's not provoked to anger or contentious, but notice it doesn't say it's not angered. Love can get angered. Jesus does get angry. Paul does get angry. Proverbs 15, verse 1 says, love knows that a soft answer turns away wrath. But the idea is if we're provoked to anger too quickly, then all we're doing is building on the strife that's already present in the room, right? And love tries to extinguish that. Love does not keep a record of wrongs. And that's an interesting one, right? Usually discussions with your spouse that finally boil up to a point, and all of a sudden, and what comes out is, yeah, but last week you did this, and last month you did this, and we keep these records of wrongs, and eventually we suppress it because we want to keep peace, and then eventually something happens, and then we throw out the 32 things that we've had on the list, and this is number 33, and that's why I'm so angry right now.
Which I'll say this as well. I'm going back to a stat as a psych major and studying marriage and family stuff. I want to say the number one reason for divorce is like resentments and those sorts of unresolved issues. And that's what you're doing is when you have resentment, it's oftentimes, not always, but it's oftentimes keeping a record of wrongs and not dealing with them. That's literally, so I guess appropriate wisdom to be read at a wedding, even though that's not what this is talking about right here, but that's definitely, you can see the outcome of that.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And think of it even social relationships with others as well, where we tolerate it when somebody does something to us, but eventually the fifth or sixth time we say, hey, here's, and it's not to say that list is necessarily inappropriate, right?
Correct.
So if a spouse is beaten by another spouse, hey, this is the third time you've done that. This is a pattern. This is a problem. This has to be dealt. There's no denying that that's the idea there.
Yeah.
But the idea behind it does not keep a record of wrongs is that love does not dwell on evil that someone else has done and saying, I'm going to hold this against you. Technically, the word actually is an accounting term. So Luke 23, verse 34, Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Right? Jesus is not keeping a record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil. I think this one's huge. I think the more we realize the evil that's being done in society, the more grief we should have. I think about it this way. Jesus says in the Beatitudes, blessed are those who mourn, right? Blessed are those who grieve. And I think you turn the evening news on, or you open up a web page or Twitter or whatever it might be, and you see the things that are happening in the world. It should cause us grief. We should weep daily because of the grief that we see around us daily. And I think that's kind of the idea. So there's an Egyptian proverb that says, your friend will swallow gravel for you. Your enemy maximizes your mistakes. So we don't delight in unrighteousness. The idea of that is that we don't rejoice when somebody falls.
And I would just say, I think our popular society is built on that right now, especially in the day and age of memes and social media. And you like when someone has some sort of gaffe, like this becomes a viral thing where everyone knows about it, and we kind of get joy in sharing in everyone's misery. I mean, that's not Christian to sit
No.
around and laugh at people. It's not, especially when it
No.
comes to we'd mentioned political divide a number of times. But how often when we're watching our favorite news channel, do they just have segments about trying to find the other guy caught in something and just make
Right.
fun of them?
Right.
It's like, that's not Christian. Like
Right. No.
there's something
Yeah.
there's something to be said for saying, is the other person having issues where they're screwing up enough? Are they competent to do their job? That's
Right.
one thing from an evaluation standpoint, because we have a voice in the process. But to literally just sit and to try to sniper pick stuff off just to make fun of people, that's not Christian.
No, not at all. We see this even more and more today in the political ire that kind of goes around, right? The name calling, the label.
Yep.
It's like, that's not how you treat other people, by calling them a name or by labeling them as something. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't say, hey, this person has done this and this and this.
You can critique.
You're critiquing them. That disqualifies them from this office. That's not the same as saying, I'm just going to give them this label, and therefore everything they do falls under this label because I label them as such. Not loving at all. Yeah, not at all. So now there's another distinction here. When it says love does not keep a record of wrongs, it doesn't mean that you don't remember them, right? There's an old phrase with the Holocaust, we will never forget. And that's very significant. And German society is structured around the Holocaust, saying we're not going to let this happen so that will never happen again.
Correct.
And I think that's important. Miroslav Volf wrote a book called The End of Memory. He says, remembering rightly, the subtitle of the book is Remembering Rightly in a Violent World. He was Yugoslavian. I think you know who he is. And he was imprisoned and brutally interrogated for months by the communists. And he said this, he said, quote, we will not forget so as to be able to rejoice. We will rejoice and therefore let those memories slip out of our minds. The reason for our non-remembrance of wrongs will be the same as its cause. Our minds will be wrapped in the goodness of God and in the goodness of God's new world. And the memories of wrongs will wither away like plants without water. Wow.
But even there, I mean, that's such a gospel-driven way of viewing injustices.
Right.
It's saying we know of the hope that we have to look forward to.
Yeah.
He mentions God's new world, and that is the hope that we have. Therefore, we don't have to worry about this.
Right. But again, at the same time, doesn't mean that you don't hold accountable those who did these things.
Yes.
And bring them to justice, or that you stay silent.
Correct.
Because that person might do that to somebody else now. All right. Love rejoices with the truth. And I think this is one that we kind of get in trouble with a little bit too, because I think we make truth as like the barometer for everything else. This is the truth. So I rejoice with this, and you guys are wicked because you don't. It's like, no, that's not the idea.
Or I'm loving you by telling you the truth, and I'm going to be a total jerk for Jesus about it. But it's love.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. For Paul, the Corinthians were rejoicing with the man who had a stepmom. And Paul's like, yeah, that doesn't correspond with truth. Kenneth Bailey, who's got some really good work, he spent most of his life in the Middle East. And so Bailey looks at the biblical text kind of from a Middle Eastern way of thinking, which is a honor and shame culture and all that stuff. And he says that a modern way to express this statement that love rejoices with the truth is that love does not find violence entertaining. Like, wow, that's powerful.
I have a question about that. Let's park on there, and maybe we don't want to sit there too long. You and I both love sports, so we're both football fans. Our teams happened to play each other this past weekend. How did the game turn out? I forgot. Are you going to edit this part out too?
Yeah.
So, but like, we both love football. That's a violent sport. Like, the point of the sport isn't to invoke violence, but it's part of the sport. So we could kind of justify that, saying, well, the point isn't to hurt each other, right?
Right.
And so let's assume that we're more noble, and we allow for that sort of thing. I really struggle. Like, I'm not a fan of boxing, mixed martial arts. Like, I'm not a fan of that stuff. Like, when the point is literally to beat the snot out of the guy.
Yeah, I can't watch it anymore. I used to watch it when I was a kid. Muhammad Ali and George Foreman and all that stuff. Joe Frazier. Yeah, I can't watch it anymore because this is that barbaric.
Something that should we have those sorts of conversations? Is this a clear, like, a straight line between, the Bible and violence and, an ethic that we said, no, Christians should not engage in this sort of thing? And if not, where do you draw the line? Or is this a conscience issue? Like, what do you do with this?
Well, I don't know that I'm going to sit here and pontificate and say this is where the line is. I think what we need to do is say, here's the biblical ethic, and now you need to address this yourself. I've had football players in my classrooms before, and they said, we talk about this, the Christians on the team. And they said, we talk about this in the locker room amongst Christians, at what point is going too far?
Yeah.
And it's a struggle. I don't see how a sport, and this is my opinion, like boxing or mixed martial arts, to say the point of the sport is to prove that I'm stronger and better than you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I do that by inflicting violence on you,
Mm-hmm.
to the point of submission. I don't see how I can do that as a Christian. I don't see how I can do it. I'm not saying the Christians don't do it, or that none of the people that participate in it are not Christians. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just simply saying I can't do that. I have a problem with hockey myself, because fighting is part of the game. If not any hockey fan, they're going to say, like, hey, look, somebody slashed that guy. They need to let the goon's going to have to come on the ice and let the guy know you can't do that. You can't slash, Wayne Gretzky or whoever the star of the modern sport might be. But I have a problem with that myself personally. I struggle with that. Doesn't mean that, if the Bruins make the finals, I wouldn't watch it. And maybe I would, but I don't think football, especially because they've toned it down so much, realizing the fact that you're doing serious damage to these people's brains.
I mean, the whole thing of CTE and all the studies are coming out. It's like that becomes a legitimate Christian ethic, even now compared to 20 years ago when that information wasn't there. Ought a Christian participate in that when you could literally be doing damage that completely affects this person? Like, should they be engaging in that?
Well, I think I think they can engage in it, as long as the sport is taking measures to remedy that or to minimize that, right?
Okay.
To limit that. The reality is you can get hit with a baseball in the face, right? Tony Canigliaro, famous Red Sox player, and die a number of years later as a result of that. So that makes baseball. When it first started coming out that CTE was a real thing, and it might be more than 20 years ago now, right? Football and the NFL began denying it.
Yes.
And suppressing it. That's what the whole movie's about, right? They were suppressing it. And there was a big Sports Illustrated article about this. Why? Because it was going to cost them money. And I think I've been writing a series of posts on the beast in the book of Revelation, or the beast, and what does it mean? That's a perfect example of what it is. That money and economy drives false narrative or suppresses truth, even so that other people can be harmed, endangered, and even killed because I want to profit from this. So a Christian can say, I can participate in the sport, but you better clean it up. The Christian needs to go, hey, I don't care if it costs you money. I don't care how much money it costs anybody. We need to stop this, and we need to change this, and we need to change the rules. And so the idea of the violence for the sake of violence, there was a big thing. I don't know if you probably remember, Vinnie, but ESPN used to have, the Monday Night Football show or whatever it was, and they'd show the violent hits, and they'd say, you got jacked up. Right? And they'd all say it at the same time. Well, as soon as the CTE stuff came out, the NFL said, you better stop that because we're going to get sued. So money drove the NFL, I'm sure this is the way it worked, to demand ESPN stop doing that. Well, the Christians should be demanding that you stop doing that, not because of money, but because love demands that we care about the well-being of others. So I think that's how I would look at it. So I think you can participate in these sports. I think some of them, for myself, I can't. And I think everyone's going to have to make their own decisions. But I think that there has to be ethics involved. So you were going to add something else.
I forget what it was now. It's
All right,
gone.
cool.
It's probably insignificant. But I will say this. It's interesting when you look at NFL promos from the 70s, because it's all the slow motion hits of like a Jack Tatum armbar.
Deacon Jones used to smack the guy in the head. That's
exactly.
How he
You see these dudes flipping, doing windmills, and it was like, watch the NFL, and it's like, oh my gosh, like it's crazy.
But we were more macho. We were more men than they were. It's like, well, you were also more barbaric. It's funny because we talk about the gladiators of the ancient Roman world and how barbaric it was. Then they go to watch these people die by being eaten by animals or killing one another. And it's like, and we turn that stuff on our TV all the time. Right? It's not real. It's like, but there are cop shows out there that are real and people get thrills of that. I'm like, no, this is grieving. That's just my thought. I think it's grieving, and I think we should grieve. And because we should grieve at that, there's a point where I'm like, I can't keep watching this because it just makes me so sad. Right? And I think that's something we just need to consider there. So, Paul then adds 4 things. And he says, love covers all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, and it endures all things. And now your translations might differ on the first one. It covers all things, or it protects, it keeps confidences. I think the New American Standard says it bears all things. Let me look. Yeah, it bears all things in the New American Standard. The idea is that love protects somebody else by covering things so that they're not exposed. Bailey says it this way. He says, I can share the secrets of my heart with someone, knowing that they will not leak these secrets to somebody else because you love me. Right? That's what love does. Love says, hey, listen, you can be vulnerable with me and transparent with me, and I'm going to help you and protect you in the midst of this. And I'm not going to go share it with everybody else. Because obviously, by the way, you get some dirt on somebody else. That's the way of elevating yourself, by putting somebody else down. And the answer is no, it doesn't do that. So the verb actually that's used here, that covers all things or bears all things, whatever, is actually used to refer to a covering something that has a liquid in it that keeps the liquid from coming out. In other words, love does not leak. The noun form is used for a roof, right? So love doesn't leak things out that exposes somebody's and makes them vulnerable. Love believes all things. Obviously, things revealed by God. It doesn't believe everything. It believes what's been revealed by God, but it acts upon them. Right? And it doesn't believe naively. It believes with intelligence, right? It rejoices with the truth, but it also acts upon them. And that's the hard part, right? Because when we know that something's the truth, and the hard part of love is the fact that we're selfish and self-centered human individuals. And if love, by definition, is to not seek one's own interests, then the love is almost antithetical to the sinful nature that we have. I wouldn't say it's antithetical to our nature, because I think we're born with the nature instilled by God to love. I think that sinfulness that we have been corrupted by is what makes it difficult. So love hopes all things, and love endures all things, perseveres, remains constant, remains faithful. Love never fails. And this gets us to the last part of the section then of Paul's description of love. So he begins by saying, hey, what love looks like with regard to spiritual gifts in verses 1 through 3. And then in verses 4 through 7, he kind of defines what love is. And then in verse 8, he says, and love never fails. And the reason why love never fails is because it's eternal. And think about it this way. Love is who God is, or what God is. And God is eternal. God has no time. And so for eternity, we will love. That's who we will become. Whereas spiritual gifts, that's why Paul says, love never fails. But if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away with. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there's knowledge, it will be done away with. Because those things are not necessary in eternity. We don't need to prophesy. God's sitting right there. We have access to divine knowledge right in front of us. Whereas love will abide, and love is eternal.
It's interesting, just from a translational standpoint. A lot of other translations, love doesn't fail. It says love never ends. But it still has that kind of that same kind of idea of failing or ending. It's not eternal, I think, is the phrase that you said.
Yeah. So the idea then is spiritual gifts are only for the present time, right? They're only for this moment, for this point in history. Once the eternal comes, and there's no need for spiritual gifts. And that, again, confirms that this passage is been fashioned by Paul to address the situation and circumstance in Corinth. I'm sure if Paul were writing today to whatever church it might be or whatever group, he would change and transition. Love doesn't, go on Facebook and say things like this that denounces a group of people, because in doing so, you are implicating someone else in there who takes that as an attitude of hatred towards them. Things of that nature there. So it's probably the case that the people in Corinth had concluded that tongues was proof, as I said earlier, that they had attained the ultimate state, the ultimate state of existence. And Paul's like, no, tongues doesn't even exist into the future. But love never fails. Love never fails.
That's a side point. I forget who I read said that on a similar topic as missions don't go on forever. There's a day when there's no need for missions,
right? But
worship is eternal. Like just putting some of those things that we practice in the church into perspective, where it's like, what are the things that actually go on and on? Like there's never a time where worship will end, even though something like missions and evangelism will. And it's the same thing. Like love goes on forever. Like that doesn't stop.
And I would say, and your worship isn't worship unless you're loving.
Yes, agreed.
Right. I think we make this distinction that worship is what I do in church.
Yeah.
and raising my hands. Oh, if you're Presbyterian, you don't. But
I'm Baptist, so we don't either. So
yeah. And singing loud or whatever it might be, singing loud for all to hear. Okay, sorry. But we think that worship is what I do in church, and the answer is no. Worship is what we do at all times, because we worship God by loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor as yourself, and therefore, it's an act of worship when we go out there and care for others and care about others and display that care for others and for justice and whatever else it might be.
Well, and think about it. I'm going to do a very rough recitation of Hosea chapter 6. But the whole point in Hosea 6 is that, hey, it's like, I don't want your offerings and all this stuff, which is interesting because it's like they're doing all the stuff that God had commanded them to do in Torah. And Yahweh's like, no, I don't actually want this stuff because I don't have your heart. That's the thing I want. So doing the thing itself actually isn't the thing that pleases me. If it's not coming from a right posture, it doesn't matter.
Right. So, hey, we have a letter. I think this was in Kenneth Bailey's work. Bailey's book is called Paul Through Mediterranean Eyes. And it's basically kind of a commentary on 1 Corinthians. And I'd like you to read it. It's a 14-year-old boy from Lebanon who wrote the following kind of a reflection from a relative's home after I think his own home had been destroyed. So you want to read that?
Okay. I can still hear the sound of thundering guns telling me that somewhere nearby people are dying. Ever since we left the village, I feel as though something has been shattered inside of me. We have lost everything. Our house was burned. My books were torn to pieces. Our furniture was stolen. But what is more important is that the soft nights and the fresh mornings in the village are gone. And with them, I have lost my roots and have become like grass blowing in the wind, as the psalmist put it. Time is no longer the unending chain of hours and minutes, marked by the hands on the huge clock at the entrance to my grandfather's house in the village. The big clock, with its rhythmic sound that kept track of every heartbeat throughout the house, is broken, and time on it standing still. For me, time used to be the time of sleeping and of waking up and of working in the field, the time of life. But now time has left me. It belongs to the one who stands behind the thundering gun. It is the time of death. One night early in September, our village was shelled and we fled. We hid in a cave near our small brook, waiting for the mad night to subside. But the guns did not stop. So we fled again through the valley until we reached Beirut. We thought we had escaped, but the dark night caught up with us in all its madness. Am I living through a nightmare? Has time really stood still ever since the big clock was broken on the wall of my grandfather's house in the village? One day, someone came and told us that our house in the village, my grandfather's house, was looted and burned. The young men burned it after emptying it together. My anguish grew into hatred. Hatred is strange, for it takes many forms. For me, it is like a boil. It took root within me and sowed the seeds of death in my heart. It grew and spread like a boil, with nothing to pus inside. I woke up at the sound of the big guns and asked myself, how can a young man stand behind a gun and fire all those rockets around us? I thought of that young man, and to me, he acquired the face of that other young man who looted and burned my grandfather's house. Then, in the midst of the sound of thundering guns, from the depths of my despair and pain, I finally understood. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I am but sounding brass like the empty shell cases of the big guns. Love alone can bear the burden of the living, for it bears all things. It bears this young man who is standing behind the gun and the other young man who burned my grandfather's house. We carry our dead with us like open wounds. All of us have such wounds. Life is different. Life is the realm of love which overcomes death. I pray that the living Lord may reign in our lives and not our dead. Wow.
All right. Hey, I think we've touched on it pretty well. 1 Corinthians 13 is in the midst of this section of Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians on spiritual gifts. The church in Corinth had some people within it that had thought that they had attained some special elite status because they were speaking in tongues. Paul's answer is, if you're not using your spiritual gifts for the sake of love, which is to edify others, then they're worthless. And instead, love is like this. And he goes on to define that love is like the cross that lays down its life for the sake of the other. It considers others more important than themselves. And then the conclusion is, and love is eternal, and the spiritual gifts aren't. So what's more important is that we manifest love more so than we manifest these spiritual gifts that lead us to boast and brag and things of that nature. Let us finish, unless you have any other thoughts, Vinnie. I got a list of verses here. We're not going to read them. Obviously, we don't have time any longer. I'm going to list them now for those of you who are listening. I'm going to put them in the show notes. And just to encourage you to say, you know what, go spend some time, if you listen to this episode on love, and go read these verses. And maybe the things that we've kind of chatted on here a little bit today will help enlighten your understanding of these texts and help you understand what love looks like, and maybe just make these texts a little bit more known. So Leviticus 19, verse 18. That's obviously the second commandment. Matthew 5, verse 43. Matthew 5, 44 through 46. Matthew 19, verse 19. Matthew 22, verses 39 and 40. Mark 10, verse 21. Mark 12, verses 31 through 33. Luke 6, verses 27 through 38. Luke 10, verse 25 through 27. John 15, verses 12 through 17. James chapter 2, verse 8. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. And 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. 1 John chapter 2, verse 10. It's like the whole 1 John. Just read the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
But 1 John chapter 3, verses 10 through 18. 1 John chapter 3, verse 23. 1 John 4, verse 7. 1 John 4, verse 11 and 12. 1 John 4, verses 20 and 21. And 1 John chapter 5, verse 1. And then 2 John verses 5 and 6. So I think that's kind of gives you some homework maybe to go back on and reflect on. I don't think we should. Yeah. And then the next thing would be to say, you know what, we're going to not only make this our prayer, but a commitment of our lives to say, Lord God Almighty, I can do all things through Christ Jesus who gives me strength. Help me to love in this situation. Help me to love in that situation. Help me to love today. Make that our prayer every day. Help me to be a person who images you by being loving in this moment. Someday we'll stand before his throne and he'll say, well, you did all right.
Well, and I think it's important to note that we have there's always that joke of the Sunday school answer, where if you say Jesus, love, or God, you'll get the thing right. And this seems like one of those things that you graduate from, where it's like, okay, yeah, we know about the love thing. Now let's get into the deep theology stuff.
Right.
And it's like, you never graduate from love. Like, it's got to be there all the time.
Right. Yeah. And another homework assignment to do, by the way, is to go and read 1 Corinthians 13 and put your name in the text. Instead of saying love, say Rob is patient. Yeah. Right. Well, anyway, you get the idea. Rob is kind, right? Rob does not brag. Well, okay, let's skip that one too. But just insert your name and make that your prayer. And don't go, well, that's absurd. It's like, no, that's the point. The point is that we're supposed to be able to insert our name there.
Yeah.
Good homework. All right. Hey, very well.
And unfortunately, right now I can only read it with a Vinnie ought to be. Vinnie ought to be. I can't wait to the point I could put is.
Rob's trying to be kind. It just ain't working.
Yeah.
Trying to be patient. It ain't happening fast enough.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. Cool. Well, hey, man. Good show today.
What? I hate your ratings a little bit less today than I did yesterday. Am I getting better?
It's not my fault that you guys can't run a lateral. All right. Well, next week we will hop into chapter 14, and which is continuing still the themes. It's not a new section. And man, we are almost done with 1 Corinthians. This is amazing.
Hey, by the way, let's close with a song.
With a song?
Yeah. I love you. I love you. Say to the Lord, I love you.
I don't know this song.
You don't know it?
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please subscribe to and like our podcast. You can follow Rob's blog at determinedtruth.com or purchase his books on amazon.com. See you next time.